Hi guys, today we're going to run briefly through the three energy systems in the human body and we're going to discuss the first energy system in a little bit of detail. So before we really launch into things, it's really important to understand what energy systems are all about. So we need to talk about chemical fuel. So your body's ability to extract energy from food and transfer it to the contractile proteins in your skeletal muscle determines your capacity to exercise at different durations at different intensities. This transfer of energy occurs as a result of thousands of chemical reactions. Now, some of these require oxygen and some of them don't. But basically, the general gist of this whole paragraph is that when you eat food, it's for a reason. Food's made up of chemicals. That chemical breakdown means that your body can extract energy from that food, but it's not as simple as just taking the energy from the food. Certain chemical reactions then have to occur in our body. Okay, so the muscles use a fuel called ATP. Now that stands for adenosine triphosphate. Now that will make a bit of sense in a tick when we talk about the structure of this chemical compound. But ATP, adenosine, tri being 3, phosphate. So adenosine with 3 phosphates attached. We'll also talk about ADP in certain chemical reactions. That's adenosine diphosphate, di meaning 2. Okay, so adenosine and 2 phosphates. And that's really important because we also talk about creatine phosphate. So lots to do with the phosphate molecule in this presentation. Okay, so ATP we mentioned in the previous slide. It's important to note that energy is stored in the chemical bond in ATP. So if you imagine that we've got adenosine attached to a phosphate, and another phosphate. Okay, so 3 phosphates, triphosphate. There's lots of energy stored between the second and third phosphate groups here. Okay, so in order to release that energy, chemical reactions occur that drop this phosphate, and then you have to attach another phosphate. Drop a phosphate, attach a phosphate. Okay, that's where the energy reaction occurs. So when that bond is broken, energy is released, allowing myosin to attach to actin. So these are just proteins within the muscle body, and you don't really need to know too much about that at this point, but basically it allows muscle contraction to occur. Okay, ADP, as I mentioned a little bit in the previous slide, you've got adenosine diphosphate, di meaning 2, so adenosine and attached to a phosphate, okay, and a CP, so this should have CP, this would be creatine with a phosphate attached. So ADP will then bind again with a phosphate group, and energy is stored that can be used later. So remember ADP, then we attach a phosphate, we drop a phosphate. Okay, so what is ATP? It's a protein, which is the adenosine component, attached to 3 phosphates. We've spoken about this. When the chemical bonds are broken, energy is released and ATP becomes ADP. So basically this is just a better way to represent that. So you've got adenosine, you've got your 2 phosphates, energy from glucose, add an extra phosphate, so that requires a bit of energy there to become ATP, and then we release energy when we break that bond. So this part requires energy, the gaining of the phosphate, and then this part releases energy for us. And that helps us gain the energy required to contract a muscle. So the 3 energy systems in our body are the creatine phosphate system. That's the immediate energy system that you use, and that's the one we're going to discuss today. And then you've got anaerobic glycolysis, so that's also known as the lactic acid system, which utilises ATP with the use of glucose. And then you've got oxidative phosphorylation, so aerobic glycolysis, which requires oxygen. So those 3 systems are never used in isolation, but they change in which system is contributing to the majority of work, depending on the intensity of work and the duration. Creatine is the first system that we use. Again, it's for immediate energy. It does not need any oxygen, and it's very short and sharp. So our ability to store creatine is very, very limited. So This system lasts basically as long as your creatine stores survive, which generally is about 10 to 15 seconds. So here ATP, so remember it starts as ADP, we add the phosphate, is made without the presence of oxygen. Now this happens because creatine phosphate has a phosphate molecule, so that's going to be the donor to make ATP in this instance. So when exercise intensity is high or energy needs are instantaneous, creatine phosphate stored in your own muscle is broken down to provide energy to make ATP. Okay, so the extra phosphate to make ADP into ATP is going to come from the creatine phosphate stores. Now that chemical reaction, as I said, does not require oxygen. So that's why it can happen immediately, because there is a delay between oxygen getting from the lungs to the muscle that is just increased in work intensity. So therefore the reaction must be able to occur without the need for oxygen. So explosive work can be achieved, but only for short periods of time at maximum intensity, as the supply of creatine phosphate is very limited, as I mentioned before. Now this slide's fairly important. So basically the primary energy source of this particular system is everything that's already in stores. So it doesn't require us to break down food or anything like that. So it's your creatine phosphate stores and your ATP, ADP stores. Duration of activity, 7 to 12 seconds, well, 0 to 15 seconds, depends on what literature you read. Sporting events, things that are short, sharp bursts and that's it, not repetitive. If it requires repetition, creatine phosphate is not restored within a short period of time, so it requires maximum rest. So interval training with brief periods of rest are not enough to restore creatine phosphate stores. Advantages: lots of energy in a short amount of time, no need for oxygen. Limiting factors are your actual stores. So hopefully that makes a bit of sense. I want you to go away, research a bit about the creatine phosphate system, and take heaps of notes. Thanks, guys.